evening. Her train at King's Cross was cancelled about 4 o'clock this afternoon, and she decided to get into an Uber. And the last we heard, she's about 10 minutes away. So we're going to be, Bryony will be here, but we're starting just a few minutes late with her. So what I might do is to say, firstly, welcome to our live streaming audience. We've got people we know from all over the world tuning in, and various climate groups, various environmental groups are tuning in to this lecture series live, and that's the idea. The idea is that we can get a far bigger audience by live streaming than we can get in one lecture theatre like this. This is a good lecture theatre to use. You will see up the back there, you might see where the camera is for live streaming. Many thanks to Nick Breeze, who's doing the live streaming. Now, we want to encourage people who are listening to these talks to give questions for us, for the speakers at the end. They will be accepted by Twitter using the hashtag CCLS17.
It's Bryony's computer. Can I unplug this?
To do for?
Bryony's lecture.
Is she here now?
Yeah, she's here. Warm them up.
Okay, so I'm warming her up, but if I unplug that, then we don't have...
Okay.
Oh, I'll just... So questions either through Twitter or through the YouTube channel itself. You can feed questions in that way, and of course we'll have questions from the audience. I did want to say that all of this came to be because of the work of David Mackay, who lived in Cambridge. He was a Regis Professor of Engineering here in Cambridge, where I work. He was an honorary fellow of Trinity College. He was the chief scientific advisor for the Department of Energy and Climate Change for 5 years. And very sadly, he died in April last year. So this is an anniversary event to celebrate the work of David. Now, Bryony has done excellent work in navigating the storms. I was going to put up some pictures of things that you were trying to navigate, Bryony. For instance, various storms. So what we will do is we'll take just a 2-minute break while we're getting Bryony connected. Do chatter amongst yourselves. That's absolutely what we need to do. So, what I could do is turn that off. So that might... Well done. How was your...
Oh gosh, well I don't want another day like that, but there we go.
No, but it's...
Unmute it. Right. Is this going to work, you think? But it's not. We don't want that, do we? How do I get it back to the start? Right. Oh, that's because it's on the wrong side. If we go right to the top. No. How's that? And it's just this to, yeah.
Are you happy?
Oh, that's, no, this is not gonna, why does that keep happening? I should probably, how do we stop that? Settings. Have you got anyone technical here who can stop the, I just need to stop it from connecting to the, well, every time it's trying to connect me to
Welcome to the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series 2017. This is the first of 4 talks. Today we'll be hearing from Baroness Bryony Worthington. Then in a week's time in this room, Anthony Hobley, and then a week after that, Kevin Anderson, and then the 4th in the series is part of the Cambridge Science Festival, and that will be in the Lady Mitchell Hall, and that will be a panel discussion with the 3 speakers plus Martin Rees, who's here with us tonight, and Jeanne Martin, who's a PhD student in University of College London, who's part of the Youngo organisation of the United Nations. Tonight we're very happy to have Baroness Bryony Worthington with us. She's a member of the House of Lords and was the principal author of the Climate Change Act. Is that fair to say?
One of the authors.
Perhaps. So without further ado, I will hand over to Bryony and she will tell us about her observations on the race between physics and politics.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, thank you, and apologies for my late arrival. I fear I lost the race between myself and Storm Doris this evening, but I am here, and I'm delighted to be here. Actually, it's a great honour to be invited to address you, but also to take part in this event as a series of lectures to really mark the memory of Professor David Mackay, who is sorely missed. He was an extraordinary character and made a massive contribution to energy policy in the UK. I first met David over a cup of tea at Darwin College, where he was in his customary fluorescent bicycling jacket, which is somehow fitting because the brightness of his intellect was just hard to compete with, really. And I'm afraid David's lectures were amazing to sit through, and he conducted them at a breakneck speed with usually around 100 slides to get through, full of his own insights and his own analysis. I'm not going to even attempt to emulate that, I'm afraid. Instead, I'm going to offer some personal reflections on my journey through working on climate change for over the last decade and a half, and the sort of interface between some of the hard numbers of climate change and the more fuzzy world of politics. And I thought I'd start by just saying a few words about partly what motivates me, but also the nature of the race, really. And in my view, it's to keep our home habitable. As far as we know, this is the only planet that sustains intelligent life that we know of to date, although I did note that NASA put out a press release yesterday with the exciting news that we found another solar system with 7 rocky planets, roughly of Earth size. And that's hugely exciting, but I don't think we should get complacent. 40 light years, or 235 trillion miles away, it's going to be quite a long time before we can reliably expect to set up camp on another planet. And so we do have to act prudentially in preserving the rich biodiversity of life on this planet, which is our only home. And that is quite a weight of responsibility for us as a species. We're facing something of an evolutionary bottleneck, and there are people in the audience who are far better placed than me to talk about these topics, but there is a great weight of responsibility on our generation to act. So we inadvertently kick-started this race at the start of the Anthropocene era, which many place it around the middle of the last the middle of the last century. And this was when we began making fundamental changes to the global atmosphere in earnest, increasing exponentially the rate at which we were burning fossil fuels and undertaking extensive land use change. So we've been rapidly stoking the engines of global climatic change ever since. And now the risks and impacts arising from that global experiment are increasingly evident. And it's not surprising. The law of conservation of energy tells us that in a closed system, and the Earth's atmosphere is a closed system, essentially, thanks to gravity and our magnetic field, it means that energy is neither created nor destroyed. So essentially, we're busy creating a far more energetic climate for ourselves than we've been used to. And so physics, in a sense, is off and running. The problem is we don't quite know how fast it's running, and we don't ultimately know where the end point will be from this race. Although our ability to model the future does give us some indications. An overheated planet will put stress on many of the natural systems that we rely on, which will struggle to adapt in the timescales that we're facing. We're looking at raised sea levels, acidified oceans, severely depleted biodiversity, prolonged droughts, reduced food supplies, migration on a massive scale, and extreme weather events, as we've already witnessed today. So there's a huge amount at stake. And unfortunately, despite this huge risk that's building, the short-term political context and the daily perturbations distract us from this fact. And around the globe, if we're able to tune into these signals, the evidence is clear to see that we are in an age of consequences. Extreme high temperatures in the Arctic currently, heat waves in Australia, drought and famine in Northeast Africa, flooding in California, ongoing coral reef bleaching, news about deoxygenation of oceans. There is a constant stream of information now for those who are tuned to it that show us that many of the impacts that we were expecting to unfold over the second half of this century are starting to be felt now. So humanity is, in a sense, really only just getting off the starting line when it comes to doing something about the risk of climate change. And if we're in a race, what could we perhaps choose as a metric for progress in that race? And one metric is the measurement of parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which has been being measured in the Mauna Loa Observatory since the 1960s. And it's quite depressing reading, really. 2015 was the first year in which the 400 parts per million level was breached continuously for 1 year. They had been over 400 for shorter periods, but this is the first in which the whole year was above 400. And perhaps even more alarmingly, the rate at which the parts per million is increasing. So we see that the rate was rising over the last 50 years by 1.7 parts per million. Over the last 5 years, it rose by 2.5. So not only are we not yet seeing a bending of that curve, but it seems to be exponentially going in the wrong direction. So we need to drastically up our game. And it is perhaps useful to pause and think about timeframes. It's kind of quite alarming, really, how long we've been aware of this problem, or at least how long certain parts of society have been aware of this problem. This is an article in the New Zealand press from 1912, where clearly raising a bit of an alarm there about the continued burning of fossil fuels acting as a blanket on the world's atmosphere and causing climatic change. So if it was the end of the 19th century when scientists first began thinking about this and the negative effects of releasing all of the CO2 from the Industrial Revolution, it really wasn't until the latter part, or towards the end of the 20th century, before climate change started to be taken seriously in mainstream political discourse. And perhaps the first Earth Summit marked something of a waypoint in 1992, where climate change was very clearly discussed. And then shortly after, in 1994, the UN Treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was ratified. And this was a big step forward. It set out a long-term goal that we should avoid dangerous man-made climate change, and it provided a framework for action on an international level. But unfortunately, looking back with hindsight, it did set up some rather unfortunate circumstances in that it split the world essentially into two camps, the developed and the developing world. And it didn't set out any rules for how membership of those camps ought to be assessed over time. So we became frozen into a situation where there was half of countries expected to take action and another half not. And as we all know, that rapidly became something of an anachronism when we saw the rapid rise of China and its exploitation of fossil fuels and its development of its economy, which caused then the US to feel that it would be inappropriate for it to take on targets if China wasn't taking part. So this was our first foray into trying to solve this problem, but it was really only 2015, just a year and a half ago, when we actually saw the first truly global approach to climate change, and it was the ratification of the Paris Agreement. And I don't propose to spend too long on this because I'm sure you're all well aware of what was in the Paris Agreement and how it was a step change in our approach to tackling the problem. It perhaps is just worth pausing to think about the Paris equation that was set for us. So moving on from just a statement that we're going to avoid dangerous man-made climate change, what the Paris Agreement did was put some specificity to that challenge. And the Paris equation is that we should achieve net zero emissions in the second half of this century. And that really equals man-made emissions minus man-made sinks should equal zero before 2100. Now that's quite a precise challenge. It's an algorithm that we can all perhaps try and approach and contribute where we can to solving. If you express that as a carbon budget, it's estimated that we have around a safe carbon emissions budget of around 3 trillion tons of carbon, but that half of that budget has already been emitted. And that at the current rate of emissions, the remaining half will be completely used up by 2040. So there is a need to act quickly if we're to significantly reduce the risk that we're facing. So timescales do matter, and it does unfortunately fall to us and our generation to do something about it. And I think what the Paris equation also points out is that we really can't afford to take anything off the table when it comes to tackling climate change. We've got to reduce emissions, but we also need to think about the other part of the equation, the man-made sinks, because if we do overshoot that budget, and it looks like we might, then we are going to have to think about how we can enhance those natural sinks that form part of the carbon cycle. So all the world's best engineering minds and socio-political brains need to be applied to this equation. One last word on Paris is that I think what was quite interesting is that the threat of Donald Trump was sufficient enough to actually caused Paris to come into force earlier than it might otherwise have done. So rather unwittingly, President Trump helped bring about the ratification of Paris. So it's not all doom and gloom. So on to what I wanted to talk about, which is some of the political headwinds that we're facing. If this were not all quite challenging enough, I did want to just give you some reflections on why politics of climate change is difficult, but also offer some examples of how we can help to overcome them. So the political headwinds that we're facing. The first thing I wanted to just talk about was the tragedy of the commons. So this is an image of space debris. It's obviously a representation of the volume of space debris that's estimated to be circling the globe, put together by the ESA in 2013. I chose this because it's just a reflection of how each individual action that we take can contribute to a global problem that nobody has overall responsibility for solving. And I could have put up over the image about overfishing or overgrazing, or even the plastic gyre that's circulating in the Pacific Ocean. These are all examples of where individual actions are contributing to a global problem, but there's no obvious global mechanism for dealing with it, not yet at least. And it forms a political problem, this global commons issue, because individual countries, you can always say, well, what's the point in us acting? We're only a small part of the problem. And then we felt that particularly keenly when we were drafting the Climate Change Act, because we were continually told, well, the UK only represents 2% of emissions, why should we bother? We're tiny and insignificant in comparison to, say, China or the US. And we made a good case back that actually that may be true, but we had a moral imperative to act. We were, after all, the home of the Industrial Revolution. We had unwittingly started this experiment, and it was now incumbent upon us to act. And we also made a strong case that if we showed leadership, others would follow. Now, at the time, that was not by any means a given. We hoped others would follow, but we couldn't be certain of that fact. But anyway, we did prevail, and we managed to pass legislation that was at the time a world first, committing us to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050 in a series of legally binding carbon budgets. Now, thankfully, what we said to the Treasury at the time has been proven to be true, and others have followed. Most recently, Sweden, and I do love this picture of them signing their law that commits Sweden to reaching that net zero target by as early as 2045. And they actually cited the UK's Climate Change Act as a model that they'd looked at carefully and followed. And the graph on the right-hand side just is to illustrate the sheer number of climate change related laws now that have been passed. Over 99 countries now have something over 800 laws related to climate change, and the pace of which they've been passed has been doubling. So that's a little bit of glimmer of hope that leadership does work. We can't take part in a race to the bottom, but we can hopefully kick off a race to the top, leading by example and having faith that leadership will engender a spirit of cooperation, and followers will join us. So that's the tragedy of the commons and maybe how to overcome it. There's another tragedy, and that's the tragedy of the horizon. Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, is credited with bringing this phrase into popular use in relation to climate change. And really it means that short-term thinking is unfortunately endemic throughout politics, but also throughout our financial system. The pace at which politicians are now expected to respond to events is staggering. It's now reduced down to the time it takes to send a tweet almost. And this is leading to really poorly informed decision making. And I've seen it firsthand, just quite how it's a complete hamster wheel of activity, but with no real long-term oversight laid over it. So this short-term thinking truly is a tragedy. And as I say, it's not just in politics. We also see it in commercial decision-making, where the focus on the share price and the quarterly reporting, at least in Western capitalist systems, is the focus of many companies' short-term decision-making. So what's the is there an antidote to this short-termism? Switching off Twitter might be one, but it's hard. You know, we're hardwired to be interested in the soap opera that's unfolding. But a more enduring solution is to create and support independent apolitical institutions and frameworks that have a long-term view built into them. Much like Cambridge University, it's been around for many hundreds of years and it'll be around for many hundreds more. And although even Cambridge is feeling the pressure to perform and produce results on a short-term basis, I have confidence that it will carry on taking the long-term view that it does, and that will be a huge gift to those people who will accept and listen to the experts who are housed here. And I'd argue that the House of Lords is another such institution. It has its failings, and I certainly wouldn't say it's perfect, but it does have the advantage of being able to take a long-term view. And it has a particularly interesting feature, which is the non-affiliated crossbenchers, which Professor Rees is an esteemed member of, who are able to correct the swings and balances of the party political system, since they're there as individuals to reflect on the policy and to truly take an independent view on which way to vote. And I think it would be a sad loss if that part of our political process were ever to be dismantled. And the other example I give is the Committee on Climate Change. This is another feature of our landscape, of our climate change policy landscape, and it was brought into being by the Climate Change Act. And I should pay tribute to Tony Grayling, who was then the special advisor to David Miliband, and it was his idea to create a new institution of independent experts that could advise the government on the setting of the carbon budgets. And he obviously was a very intelligent man, and with the benefit of hindsight, we can see just how important that insight was. That is an institution that really has helped depoliticize the decision-making and keep the government on track. And if we want any better example of how this is working, we can think back to June the 30th, 2016, which was, by anyone's measure, quite an unusual week. Straight after the Brexit vote, we saw Gove and Johnson stabbing each other in the back. And June the 30th was one of the most extraordinary days in British politics, in one of the most extraordinary weeks in British politics. But on that day, the government actually issued into law the fifth carbon budget, because it was compelled to do so by the deadline set in the Climate Change Act. And they'd already missed one deadline, and so were now facing the potential for a judicial review. So they had to simply accept the advice of the Committee on Climate Change, or risk going through some protracted legal proceedings that they didn't want to do. So that very day was when they decided to set the fifth carbon budget at the level that was advised to them by the Committee on Climate Change, which is 57% below 1990 levels by 2030, which is an ambitious target. And I think it's a good example of how, no matter how crazy the day-to-day politics, if you set up the right frameworks and the right institutions, you can still make progress. So that's two tragedies. Third tragedy, I'm not sure if it's a tragedy, but certainly a feature of the political landscape, is the power of the incumbents when it comes to the energy system. So it's easy to demonize the energy sector, especially the fossil fuel sector, but the reality is that they've been doing a phenomenal job for many decades. They've lifted millions out of poverty, they've created comfortable lives for many of us, and they've pretty much built everything we see around us. But they've made an awful lot of money doing so. Not everything they've done is without blame, but essentially they have and do provide an essential service which is very good at what it does. And that's a problem. It's a problem on many levels, partly because it's highly capitalized, lots of investment's been sunk into the infrastructure, but also it's been so profitable that they now have, and they wield a lot of power. They're able to afford the most expert lawyers, the best regulatory advisors, the best lobbyists. And so they will exert pressure to protect their bottom line. And that can cause political difficulties, and there are lots of examples where we see that embedded the power of the incumbent is a brake on political progress. But what's the antidote to that? Well, I would argue that essentially it's about clever policy making. There's been, I think, a tendency to try to find one solution to solve the problems of climate change. You just need a carbon price at the right level and it'll all be fine. Economists like to talk about the need to just install one simple price that will meet the social cost of carbon and it'll all be fine. But actually that's far too simplistic, and it doesn't take into account the political pushback you get whenever you try to do anything that's very broad in its coverage. And so probably what we need to do is accept that the political reality of policy making is that it's easier to pass a policy that is very targeted in its nature, such as a subsidy for a particular technology or a particular regulation, than it is to try and instill a widespread carbon price across many actors, because you will get more pushback. And I think the other thing to take note of, and I'm not an economist, so I hesitate to criticize them too much, but there is, I think, another kind of truism that says, oh, well, you know, Pigouvian taxation is the answer. Simply shift the taxation burden from the things we want to see more of onto the things we want to see less of, and that should work its way out in the future. But the difficulty with that is that if you view the world through the lens of the Treasury, actually they're not interested in taxing things that we want to see less of. If you have a shrinking tax base, that makes Treasury officials very uncomfortable. And another reason why the fossil fuel industry is so dominant is that they have paid an inordinate amount of money into the Treasury in the form of taxes over the decades that they've been operating. And so there's now obviously a very close relationship between the Treasury and those industries who've been funding much of the welfare state that we rely on. And at the moment, that tax base is shrinking. We are seeing less revenue coming in from the North Sea, but we're also seeing traditional use of fuels being replaced by technologies that don't have a fuel. So how do you tax the sun or the wind? It causes quite a difficult problem for the Treasury. So actually, we may need to have a rethink about this belief that you should tax the things you want to get rid of. Reality is that a Treasury likes to tax something that's going to stick around for a long time and give them a steady income. And it may be time to look again at how renewables are contributing and whether it wouldn't be sensible to accept now on a voluntary basis a small tax, perhaps one that goes into a sovereign wealth fund that enables us to build our tax base for the future and generates wealth for the nation. I'm not, I don't want to jump on the bandwagon of taxing solar to death, but I do think there's a question here about how you ensure that value is recycled into the public purse. So I'm not sure how much time I've got, but I'll keep going on and someone will wave at me if I'm running over. The other thing I want to talk about, which is 10 minutes, is that we ought to also just accept, and David Mackay was brilliant at this, that energy policy is complicated and complex, and there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. And we ought to stop believing that policies should be either or, that there's just one thing or the other. We need additive policies, and I just wanted to raise one issue that came up during the passing of the last energy bill in the House of Lords and in the House of Parliament, and that's the unintended consequences of us now having subsidies to keep the lights on. So the Treasury and the government in its wisdom has decided that we'll deal with climate change over here in this set of policies, and we'll deal with keeping the lights on over here in another set of policies. And by keeping those two things distinct, they've actually created some tensions and unintended consequences. And the outcome of that is that the market, in its wisdom, has found that the best way to exploit the keeping the lights on subsidy is to invest in some of the most inefficient and polluting forms of energy generation possible, and that's diesel generation. And it's not even necessarily new diesel generation, some of it's being imported from Africa, would you believe it? So this is not necessarily the most modern, forward-looking energy policy you might expect of a country like the UK. And it becomes out, it flows from the fact that there was this rigid belief that you couldn't have policies trying to achieve the same goal. And I think it's just been proven that that's really not the case. You do need to have complementary measures that push in the same direction so that you get the right outcome. Finally, right, we talked a little bit about the politics of how you get policy through, and this is really Emil Dimanchev from MIT's slide, but I've borrowed it off him because it just points, it really shows that in terms of getting something through politically, the reason why we see subsidies for renewables that seem illogical, and I know if David were with us, he'd be telling us what a terrible idea is that we're paying all of these solar panels so much money. But the reality is that sometimes logic doesn't prevail, and there is a political reality as to why those narrow policies sometimes easier to get through than broad measures. I wanted to just quickly, that's a very pixelated image, sorry, talk about tribalism within energy policy, because again, it's very easy to get sucked into the, oh, it should be this technology, it shouldn't be solar, it should be this, it shouldn't be that. I mean, in reality, no one technology is going to be able to do it. And I'm definitely not in the camp that says it's renewables and energy efficiency more than anything else. I think all technologies have got their pluses and minuses. And I recently really came to the conclusion that we need to embrace all zero carbon technologies, and that includes nuclear and it includes carbon capture and storage, because they all will do different things and contribute different aspects, and they will be needed in different countries with different political contexts. And I'm happy to say that if you look at past history, you'll see that it is the combination of technologies that really rapidly brings down emissions. Sweden, again, is another example of how they got it right. They famously slashed their emissions from their high point in 1970 by 75% through a consistent rollout of nuclear power. On a per capita basis, it's the most rapid decarbonisation of any developed economy. And I'm also happy to say that when you look at China, and arguably China now is the country that matters most, with the most populous country on the planet and the highest carbon intensity, what they do will really determine what happens to our carbon budget. And they too are embracing all of the above technologies. They're doing fuel switching, they're embracing renewables, but they're also extending their nuclear new build program. And it's that which will consistently bring down emissions rapidly. And because essentially, and I'd like to, at the end, I'm going to recommend a couple of videos to watch, but one video in particular that stands out was Bill Gates's take on innovating to zero in energy policy, and he cites David Mackay's work in that talk, and that just shows you how wide David's work was read and accelerated. And he puts a very simple equation together, which is that really to get to zero emissions, you've got to have either population or demand for energy or the carbon intensity of that energy to get to zero. One of those three numbers has to get to zero. Now, we don't want population to be at zero. We know that energy demand isn't going to be at zero. So the only thing that can go to zero is the carbon intensity. And it's the carbon intensity of our energy that really matters. And it's that number which should be the metric of progress in terms of decarbonisation, not how many gigawatts of a particular technology we've managed to install or invest in. Okay, so I think I'll just quickly race through the last bits, but there is one other impediment, if that were not enough impediments for you, and that's human psychology. There's been much written about our irrational brain, or how numbers just aren't enough to persuade us sometimes, and it is unfortunately a feature, I think, of our evolutionary biology, that we are not necessarily rational. Our old brain sometimes dominates. Our impulses, our desire for reward, they can lead us down paths that are not necessarily rational, and those but more basic instincts can be exploited. So numbers and logic aren't necessarily the only thing that drive us. And I think that there's, again, a balance. We're not entirely impulsive creatures. We also have a fairly well-developed biomass-fueled engine of our own, which is our frontal cortex, which is well adapted to problem solving. And I think what we're seeing now is the rise of a new breed of people who are not only thinking about solving global problems, but have got a track record of having a global impact. And so my hopeful thought about how we overcome human psychology is that our own psychology is shifting as we start to embrace near to, not quite yet there, but near to a global sense of civilization. And I just chose three random white men, just random, but no, these are three people who've demonstrably had a global impact in their lifetimes. And fortunately, they're all a little bit younger than a certain member of the president in the White House today. And I think these are the people who will have a lasting legacy in terms of tackling global climate change. And that's, if people don't know who they are, that's Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg, who recently published his essay on how he's going to change Facebook to be a force for good. And let's just hope that's what happens. Okay, I think I did have a few slides about how politics is too important to be left to the politicians. I'll just quickly say that there are overcomes. We still have it's okay. So we do still have forces that go beyond politics, and a couple of them. One is subsidy-free innovation. So just that desire to innovate, that desire to bring better products to market, that seems to be part of our experiences at the moment. And this is a picture of the Sistine Chapel because it illustrates two things. One, they recently retrofitted all of their lights with LEDs, and LEDs are a really fantastic story because they weren't brought forward by complicated government policy. They were brought forward probably by some basic funding into academics, but then they just took off because they were a better product and popular. And that shows you that, you know, just all of this perturbation in the political realm, you can still break through with really good technologies as long as they're popular and affordable and widely distributed, and LEDs is a great example. The other reason this is important, I think, is because it illustrates also the role of religion, and that is a powerful force still in society, and particularly the Pope's encyclical had a huge effect in bringing people to the story of climate change. And I've met people in the House of Lords even who've said that you know, they had believed Nigel Lawson until their local vicar had raised it, or until a religious element came into the debate, and that caused them to change their mind. So religion is a hugely important aspect. There's also the courts and litigation. I think we're going to see, it won't take many cases to be heard where companies are being poured over for recklessly carrying on with business as usual, knowing that they're contributing to risk. And we've seen some cases already being brought forward. And that could very quickly change attitudes in boardrooms. If they perceive that business as usual is carrying a risk, because now the evidence is mounting, then that could quickly start to change investment patterns. And then finally, I think, again, there's a tendency in the world of NGOs to sort of pit one solution against the other. It's either inside track, working on policy and detailed corridors of power, or it's chaining yourself to a train or a bulldozer and stopping things on the front line. Again, it's not either or, it's and. And I think blockadia, or whatever you want to call it, the sort of direct action to prevent projects that you think go against our interests in keeping the world a stable place will rise. I mean, it's just almost inevitable as people feel disempowered that they will, a certain portion will decide that that's something they can't tolerate and will take to the streets. And I think that's, it has an effect in and of itself, but also helps change the political mood. So I think it's another feature of action beyond politics. I think I want to stop there, except to say that I think this is possible. I do feel hopeful. Perhaps I'm just a technology optimist, perhaps I'm deluded, but in my lifetime, I think back to when I was an undergraduate in 1990, just arriving at Queen's College, and the world was such a different place. There was no mobile phones, you had to book time in on the computer. It was, and in that short period of 25 years, I mean, I think everything's changed. And 1990 was also the first year where any renewable subsidies were introduced, first in Sweden and then in the UK. So 25 years isn't a long period of time, and yet so much has happened. And we've got, say, roughly another 25 years before that carbon budget is exhausted. And I really think the pace of change today means that we're in with a good shot. We've got things like artificial intelligence. Again, I hesitate to comment knowing that Martin's here, but machine learning, huge data analysis potential that didn't used to exist. As long as we build into our AI the idea that getting rid of all the humans is not the answer, then I think we'll have more and more tools at our disposal. So I'm hopeful, and I hope you are too. And here, if you are interested, there are a couple of real lectures that I would recommend you watching. David Mackay, in his element, speaking to Harvard It's a really fantastic exposition of his talents. Bill Gates, as I mentioned, innovating to zero, and the late great Hans Rosling, who his talk about why every woman should have a washing machine is truly worth watching. So those are 3 recommended tips. But thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Bryony. We're going to move on to questions, and the way this will work, we've got a couple of microphone holders, and because we're live streaming, any questions from the audience need to be fed into the microphone. So I'm going to be here.
Yep.
So is that okay?
I'll start over here. Yeah, that's fine.
So I think I can switch that on. That works. And well, let's begin with questions from the audience. Since the audience are here, we have a question over here. If you can receive the microphone.
Thank you. Edward Lee from Smarter Cambridge Transport. My question is what does it mean to say that something's legally binding, in the sense that if we miss our target in reducing carbon, what will the consequences be? And how will that, could we just end up sailing past and ending up with a lot of judicial ruckus, but actually, nothing actually happens with that? How do you see it actually having the effect?
And you mean in relation to the Climate Change Act in particular?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was an issue that was long discussed when we were drafting the legislation, and essentially we settled on creating a framework that would then be open to judicial review. So anybody could take the government to court for failure to comply, and there are quite a lot of points in which you could judicially review the government. Deadlines missed is one of them, but equally missing the budgets is another. And in reality, what would then happen is that it would be for the courts to decide on any damages that they might award to us against the government. And one example it might be that they would take into account the volume of emissions that have been over-emitted and force the government to make good with the social price of carbon, for example. So it could end up in a monetary penalty, but that wasn't set out in legislation. That was left for the courts to decide. So it's really important that we have an NGO, a well-funded NGO sector that can help generate those court cases should they be necessary. But actually, I'm glad to say that at the moment, just the fear and the embarrassment and the political pressure, because the Climate Change Act received cross-party support. It was hardly a dissenter against it, only 3 or 4 or 5. And so that's created its sense of kind of self-regulation as well.
Other questions in the room? So right up the back on that side.
My name's Rick Lupton from the Department of Engineering here.
Right up close here.
I was interested in what you said about getting carbon intensity of energy to 0. I think on the physics side, then it's harder to get that to 0 if your demand is bigger. And I think that's one of the things that came out of David Mackay's book, is that it's difficult to get large amounts of lower carbon energy. So if you're trying to solve that from the physical point of view, then trying to reduce demand as much as possible is also a good way to do. But maybe from the political side, that's a less appealing thing to try and do than to put your trust in technology to bring down the carbon intensity and let you keep on using as much energy as you want. So I just wondered if that was what you were trying to say, or if you had any thoughts about how we could reduce demand for energy.
I think it really depends on the per capita energy usage of the country you're talking about. So, for example, in the US, there's a huge amount of capacity for reducing. It's a very profligate user of energy on a per capita basis. Less so in India, for example. So it does depend on which country you're talking about. And I am a fervent believer that access to energy is a good thing. I don't really subscribe. I'm in Hans' camp here where washing machines are good. But you're right. I mean, obviously wasting energy, it makes no sense. But often I think politicians fall into the trap of thinking, well, we can stimulate energy efficiency through these kind of top-down directives. And actually what you find is some of the more successful methods are like the LEDs, where something emerges as a better product and then has an organic life of its own. So I'm a bit hesitant about Brussels or anyone else saying we're going to insist your demand for energy is falling, because I don't really think they've got the levers actually at their disposal. So it's not that I'm against it, I'm a bit more cynical about their ability to make it happen.
I should say that those who are listening online can feed questions either directly through the YouTube channel or through Twitter using the hashtag #CCLS17. I do have a question from Caroline in Delft. Is the EU emission trading scheme dead?
Oh, I purposely didn't mention it because I spent the last 8 years of my life working on this, and oh boy, I mean, I did talk about it indirectly because it's an example of this widely applied policy. It's hugely highly leveraged. I mean, the EU's emissions trading scheme covers 11,000 installations, nearly 2 billion tons of CO2 per annum. It's massive, but it's sort of struggling along at a price of €5, which is nowhere near the social cost of carbon. It's nowhere near what we need to see fuel switching even between. It doesn't even cause black to brown coal switching. It's, you know, so it's pretty much failing in what it was set out to do, and it's partly because of the politics. When you capture all of your heavy industry and your power sector into one policy, and then say, oh, by the way, you're going to be paying for something you previously enjoyed for free, you get a lot of resistance. So its very scope is also limiting in its ability to bring about high ambition. Is it dead? Well, no, it's sort of zombie-like, carries on forever, really. It doesn't have an end. There's no sunset clause. It will go on forever. It will reach zero at some point. I think it's 2070 something when it reaches zero. So at that point, Europe will be buying all of its allowances from somewhere. But also at that point, there may well be such a huge surplus that it takes them a while to work through that. So it's flawed, and it's flawed by politics, unfortunately.
So questions from the audience. There's another one right up the back there. Yes.
Hello, I'm Matt Box. I work in a local technology development company. I was just wondering, you said you were a technology optimist, and I came to talk about what politics can do to improve our chances of meeting these targets. I think, okay. Yeah. Can you come back to me? I'm not very good with this kind of pressure. I don't know. Sorry.
So what you're asking, I guess, is it just technology innovation, or do you need politics to help that happen?
No, it's more. I think in a world where increasingly all these new technologies you're talking about, which are great in themselves, are in the hands of an economy and powers that it seems policymakers are struggling to control. And is it always a positive thing that these technologies are coming around? And perhaps it's dangerous that we might face more of these problems and rely on the right solution just happening to be the cheapest solution, such as LEDs. Yeah, I'm not sure that, to me, that's quite terrifying, that even the policymakers and people that look at the politics are reliant on just price changes and technology developers to change the landscape we live in, when it's more of develop what sells best and what's cheapest and best at doing the job, when that might not be best for society. So I think politics...
Yeah, less laissez-faire and more directive. Well, I suppose we're fortunate in that we don't have a global system of governance that's unified. So you have different political economies doing different things. So Europe is particularly an economy that's based on the rule of law. So we like policies, we like regulations. Regulations have been used to drive innovation in Europe traditionally. But if you look at China, they sort of nominally understand the rule of law, but actually it's a much more directed economy, even to the extent that they direct their banks to what to lend money to. It's planned over 50 years. It's a planned economy, and they're doing something else. So we've got this kind of experiment happening globally about different types of political economy and how they can drive change. And if you look at the US, which is really interesting, they've got a different political economy where essentially they like to remove barriers to innovation and allow competition to rip through. I can't think of many countries who would have been happy awarding Elon Musk their contract to SpaceX, an untried, untested company, but he was a spirit of America. He was a can-do person. He was willing to take a big shot at something. And America, for all its faults, is very good at lowering barriers to entry and allowing the incumbents to be really challenged by newcomers. So, you know, the positive side of, you know, there are different experiments happening of how to bring about change, and those three major economic blocks are all doing it slightly differently. So I may be waxing lyrical about technology, but I also think there's a role to be played in Europe, particularly about how we do very clever policy making and use the rule of law to see progress. So that is a bit more top down.
Other question? We have a question here. Yes. No, I was just behind you. The child will come. Yeah.
Then I can give the microphone to you and to you as well, who was raising the hand before me. So I'm Giulia Sonetti from Politecnico di Torino Urban Planning Department. And my question is, first of all, thank you. And what is needed to change the race between physics and politics in a relay race between physics? I mean, sometimes it's difficult to make scientists, physicians, but scientists in general, talk to politicians. So what are the barriers to transform the race in a relay race when they collaborate to create a better world?
Well, I mean, I think scientists just have to keep on doing what they do, because they've been a consistent, you know, force for good, as far as I'm you know, concerned, in terms of using the scientific method, which is beautifully unfuzzy actually, and has a cynicism built into it. So you test a hypothesis to destruction. People challenge each other. It's quite a pure and logical system compared to politics, which is buffeted by a few more flaws. I know I'm putting a Panglossian view of academia, and there are challenges. My husband's an academic, but there is something about the scientific method which we've got to hold on to and preserve. Now, we seem to be going through a little bit of a swing of the pendulum where scientists are out of fashion and we need, you know, the elite are all dreadful, but that won't last. I mean, the scientific method will last, and that's what we hold on to. You know, that's what many people in this room are engaged in, and you must carry on doing so, and put pressure on the politicians to keep funding it and preserving it. And they know that they need to on one level. So I think the relay race has been going on. It will continue to go on. We're going through a bit of a difficult stage right now, but my confidence is with the scientific method.
So there was another one that came in through Twitter. With the current political climate, is climate activism really in vain? Now, you kind of mentioned that. You don't seem to think it is?
Depends what you mean by climate activism, really. I mean, the thing about climate activism is it takes all forms. You know, I'm currently driving around in an EV, which I consider to be quite a climate activist activity, because it's certainly, I'm not doing it for convenience. It's quite a funny thing, I'll never catch on. No, I'm joking, but you know, there's personal activism where you can take control of what you can take control of. You can wean yourself off petrol pumps. You can put solar PV on your roof, and you can, there's that sense of activism that comes from that. There's activism of blockading, you know, getting out there and chaining yourself to things. That's happening. It's going to keep happening. There's political activism. I mean, acting as a political person, you know, joining a party, getting involved, and I know it can be really very wearisome from personal experience, but you know, it might be worth us all joining the Conservative Party, and you know, making sure our views are felt, whatever the political colour of the party. So, you know, it's not pointless. Far from it. So,
but the more people that drive electric cars, the easier it will become. So it's.
Yes.
Okay. So we have a question. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, it's coming through. I'm retired, as you can probably see, a retired engineer. And one of the questions that bugged me, you talked about the LEDs. That's something you can do yourself. But if I wanted to reduce the carbon intensity of my gas supply, I could not do that. That needs big players to do that. And a technique, I'm speaking as an engineer perhaps, BECCS bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That can give you the other element of a carbon negative aspect to the equation that you put up. Now, we don't seem to be working on some of these techniques here. I think Scandinavia may be ahead of us, perhaps because of their forestry. Could you comment on when we can start on these?
Well, perhaps a little glimmer of hope in that BECCS, probably one of the world's first examples of BECCS, is actually being demonstrated just north of Cambridge by a company who are using CO2 to create aggregate. And the CO2 is coming from a paper mill, which is burning pulp to create waste gases, which are then being solidified into building materials. And it's happening right, just here in this county. No one talks about it, and it's completely forgotten. And it's not even certified. There's no benefit they get from doing it. They do it because it makes sense commercially to dispose of the waste. So BECCS and all these sorts of enhanced capture are going to be part of the answer. I mean, it's often about scale. We could use serpentine rock and olivine to, enhance the rate of capture that happens in the lithosphere, in rocks naturally, and that's definitely an option. Now, there's going to be an energy balance involved in that. There's going to be implications for the amount of materials we're moving around. I wouldn't take any of this off the table, but I wouldn't, nor would I say that one of these solutions is going to be the solution. It's going to be a multitude of different answers. But what I do take hope from is that people like yourself, engineers, this is bread and butter. It's, what's the problem? How do I apply my knowledge to create a solution? And we just need more people engaged in the problem. And I think actually the number of people engaging in this task is rising exponentially, and younger generations are coming in with new, fresh ideas. You see it in nuclear as well. The nuclear industry is desperately in need of a change and a modernizing revolution, really, and it's coming. There's a whole plethora of new designs being looked at. So more engineers, that's what we need. And that's not to say the existing solutions aren't also important, but I think we're not yet at the point where we can say, it's all right, we've got everything we need. BECCS is definitely part of it.
This is Charlie Kennel from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, visiting Christ College regularly. I'm trying to formulate a complex question, and you'll forgive me if I do it badly. But you started off by saying that there were you could see three broad avenues to carbon neutrality. One would be to reduce demand, the other would be to slow population growth, and the third was to improve carbon intensity. And you came down on the carbon intensity side and placed a great emphasis on technological innovation. As a scientist and so forth, I'm much happy to hear that, but I worry that we'll be unable to do the job in time. But within the carbon intensity business, you've accepted a strategy, and we all do, a strategy of trying everything. Every avenue to carbon intensity must be tried simultaneously. So why don't we also try the other two? And is it because the problem is too hard, and that the expertise for solving those two problems lie outside the rational area of science and more deeply in social science and religion?
Fantastic question. I generally steer clear of the population question. It's partly because it does, take us into a realm of philosophy and ethics that I tend not to want to dabble in. And I guess also, I suppose I continue, perhaps it's a little lie I tell myself, but I tell myself that the predictions of this population, endless population growth, are wrong, and that actually we'll see a leveling off of population as we see poverty being addressed. Now, there are some very good examples where that's just not the case. Some parts of Africa, the more affluent are, the more children you have, and so we can't rely on that. But the evidence in Europe and other parts of the developed world are that with affluence comes a leveling off of population. So that's why I think it may well have an inbuilt positive enforcement that we don't need to get too involved in. And on the energy demand, I think we'll probably address that a little bit when we're talking about the fact that at the moment access to energy is far from equal. And I would like to see countries like, I think Saudi Arabia is possibly the most energy intensive, but the US is a good example because it's so populous, such a big population. I would like to see efforts to constrain that, but ultimately, at the same time, energy is a huge enabler of human comfort and frees us up. Hans Rosling's talk is brilliant about how when the washing machine arrived, his mother had time to teach him to read books to him and go to the local library. And so not having to toil with human labor, but to use energy is a good thing. And as I say, on the Kardashev scale, right, we're going to have to get to one, which is mastery of the planet's energy. We're not there yet, but if we can get there, then I think we shouldn't have a constraint on the amount of energy that we can use.
So you've just stated that investment in human development accelerates the demographic transition and reduces the ultimate demand.
Yeah, you've said it much better than I could.
So we've got a question over here, this thing behind me. Put your hand up so I know where the questions are.
Yeah, I'm just wondering when we're actually going to hold our politicians to account on this. I mean, you mentioned your fifth carbon budget and it's going to be 57% below by 2030. Have we got to wait till 2030 before something happens? And is it going to be 2030 before the BBC actually holds anyone to account, or John Humphreys holds anyone to account, because they don't seem to do it either. So actually, when do you think that's going to happen?
Well, the fourth carbon budget, which happens a little bit earlier in 2025, which is not that far away, that's the most challenging of the budgets because it's a big step down from the third, which we're in at the moment. Are we in the third or we might be in the second? Anyway, we're in a budget at the moment. By the time we get to 2025, we have to take a really deep cut. And that's going to be a time which the government's really tested. So within the next 10 years, but in a sense, the testing of the UK's government isn't top of the list, I wouldn't have said, because emissions have been falling quite rapidly. And the reason they've been falling quite rapidly is because we've done this kind of all of the above policy making. We've got an emissions trading scheme, we've got a carbon tax, we've got subsidies for alternative technologies. We're investing in EVs and trying to electrify transport and in industry, actually. So if it came to, who should we hold to account first, the UK would not be top of my list. In fact, probably more interesting is looking at Germany. I hope Germany's going to come out, amazingly well and show that it can decarbonise using the path that it's chosen. But the evidence to date is a little bit equivocal, to say the least. So I think actually, if you wanted to invest in something in Germany, there's something in Europe, is just make sure Germany sticks the course and doesn't use this continued reliance on renewables plus coal. They've got to get themselves off coal.
Right. But I'm not German and I don't want to influence my politicians to account in this country.
Oh, well, then perhaps think about air quality or electrification of transport or something where they're evidently failing. And on air quality, they are desperately failing. So go to town on that, maybe.
There's a question over here, and then we've got one over there.
Yes, my name is Terry McAllister. I used to be editor until recently of The Guardian, and now I devote my time, part of it at least, to climate change, and I'm involved in organising these talks. But one of the things that interested me when I was writing about it was, were market solutions really going to cut it in terms of a problem like climate change that goes way beyond normal financial reporting parameters? And I was deeply aware of the fact that we seem to get investment from French state companies, from Chinese state companies, from Norwegian state companies, from Danish state companies, but not from the UK. Is there not a role for the British state to be much more proactive industrially? Why do we rely on Vestas of Denmark to provide our wind turbines? We rely on Siemens to do other things. Why is there no indigenous companies like Rolls-Royce and things really at the heart of this green revolution? And I must agree with my colleague over here. I certainly feel a sort of lack of intensity and urgency about the debate. And it's great to see so many young people here, because we organise a lot of public meetings and it's generally older folk like me who are there. And they are more complacent, I feel, about this general issue than the younger generation who want to see change much more quickly. But they haven't got their hands on the levers of power. What do we do about those issues? Sorry, that's very...
Yeah, you've raised some really important points. I mean, on the neoliberal consensus and whether the UK's kind of adherence to opening everything up to privatisation, it may be that we look back and we see the years where we liberalise energy as the anomaly, that we go back to a much more state involvement, because it's still quite a relatively new experiment. And let's face it, not everyone charged in behind us and followed. You've cited the fact that most of Europe hasn't. Most of Europe has maintained a system where the state has an involvement. And that's even despite the fact we have sort of supposed strong state aid rules, governing Europe. There's lots of ways in which countries get around those and preserve a role. And it's because energy equals power, political power. So it's not surprising. And I maybe will see a change in the UK. And it's going to be interesting, isn't it? Because you see this with Trump as well. You know, there's this kind of push and pull between, well, we know globalization is not so great, so let's go back to some protectionism, but actually, oh, hang on, loads of money's made from the neoliberal sense. So it's just not clear which way it's going to cleave. And I think the same is true in the UK post-Brexit. You may well see a return to, you know, quite overt state aid to try and build back our industries because of the political winds of change starting to really affect us. So, yeah, but in the meantime, we do have Siemens and we do have Dong. You know, we have all these industries that have forged ahead. And I don't think the UK is without its champions. And we've certainly got a lot of spin-offs out of universities that, and the climate kick, the knowledge something C is housed here for a reason, because we have got a very fertile environment for innovation out of our academic institutions.
So just a couple more questions. We've got a question over there, but it would be good to hear from some of the younger people in the audience, as Terry was saying. So we do have a couple of questions in the middle there. Over there first.
That was a bit harsh.
Yeah.
My name's Richard Hales from Adam Brooks Hospital. It's a governance question, really. Everything you say seems to suggest we've kind of lost our story about sustainability somewhere. And there's lots of organisations in and around Cambridge that have their own, or are trying to work on sustainability in their own ways, and we're one of them. And they cover, you know, private sector, voluntary sector, and public sector as well. But we don't have any way of really joining up with a central government narrative, if you like. And it's very hard to see where that might come from. I'm guessing in your position in the House of Lords, is there a narrative now? I know in the past, you know, we've had LA21 ages and ages ago. We had 1010 not long ago, which tried to bring people together with their own initiatives in their own organisations to come together to create something that everyone was working on simultaneously that gave a real story. Because I know the story I have to give Adam Brooks is always very fragmented, and all the problems you've related there all come back, but in a microcosm way. But coming up with something shared seems essential to me.
It's a really good question. Sustainability is a phrase that seems to have just slightly fallen out of fashion, really, and it's maybe it's because it's very hard to define. You know, your sustainability and Exxon's sustainability might be completely worlds apart. You know, there's perhaps too much wriggle room in the actual definition of the word, but and maybe there's a desire to go back to something more numerical. Perhaps carbon budgets is perhaps a unifying theme, and we have got a legally binding carbon budget. They do run consecutively for 15 years. They do provide a trajectory, and the reason they're called budgets is because essentially what we were trying to do is say that every emission that occurs is a liability, and you know, it stays a ton of CO2 stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. So you know, and there's a price to be paid for that, a social price. And if you reduce your emissions, that's an asset. You know, it's an investment. It's a reduction in risk. So we were trying to get the Treasury to start thinking in terms of a balance sheet where emissions being a liability and investment in reductions as an asset. We haven't quite got there yet, but that kind of applying the rules of accounting and pricing of carbon at a very local level, right the way up to a macro level, is a unifying thing, maybe. But that's the best I can come up with on the spot, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We tried that with the accounting and add things up, but we know most of our emissions come from somewhere else anyway. And it's very, very hard to come up with a figure that means anything at an organisational level.
I'll mull on that one.
So we have a question over here, yes?
I'm Safina. I'm in sixth form at the Lee School just down the road. I was just wondering, you're speaking about the multitude of different solutions that we should take, such as research and development, trading schemes, and subsidizing renewables. But what kind of ratio or balance do you think we should, or prioritizing? Because realistically, how are we going to achieve all of those things and more in the future? As you said, the optimism for technologies in the future?
I haven't worked out an equation for that one, and I don't know that anyone has. I think there's a sort of there will come a point, I think, where you don't need as many subsidies as you currently do, because there's a kind of cost curve for development that brings technologies down from their very high price through deployment, through mass deployment, into a more reasonable unit cost, and then either a very, very low carbon price or even no carbon price can tip those into then being mainstream. So you see it in some countries, for example, in Chile, where solar is so effective in Chile, and they have a very small, modest carbon tax, that really now solar investment doesn't need anything else. It's just happening. And so you need dynamic policy making is what you need to be able to keep abreast of that cost curve. So there's no point in keeping on subsidizing renewables if they're coming down the cost curve. You ought to be able to then capture them in a more broad mechanism that's slightly less expensive. And so there's never going to be a point where you can say, well, this is the formula. We do this, this, and this, and it's done. It does require groups like the Committee on Climate Change and the civil service to keep abreast of this. And because cost curves are dynamic, as are fossil fuel prices. So the other thing that can cause these things to tip into profitability is a rising oil price or gas prices becoming more expensive. And you know, there's I'm sorry, it is dynamic, and it's why policy making is interesting. You never get to the bottom of it, really. It's kind of, once you get sucked into energy policy, there's no escape.
So we've got just a couple more questions then. There's one there, and then hand the microphone down there, and I think then might be time for some refreshments.
Okay, well, hey, hi, I'm Juan Sebastián Cañar. I'm from the engineering department. I found really interesting that you said that there was a huge challenge to go ahead with the Climate Change Act, because people were saying, like, no, we're just 2% of the global emissions. And you were able to come up with the argument of leadership. And you have also said many times that energy brings up like a comfort life for many people and development. So my question is, what can you advise on this sense to convince and which argument could be good for developing nations, where, for example, they have a less amount of emissions in the global scale, and also there's a huge need of having energy for development as well?
So perhaps my husband's Indian, so perhaps if I take India as the kind of classic example where you have got a huge inequality of access to energy, and it's a genuine problem. And not only that, but you have massive social impact from the reliance on burning of biomass in homes, and you know, it's air pollution is off the scale. So it's a huge challenge, and you know, I think there is something to be said for encouraging India to leapfrog our path of development into a cleaner development path, because they have an amazing resource in that they are the most fertile country on the planet, or one of the most fertile, and they have an amazing solar resource. So, you know, they've kind of got it made, and they don't have that much fossil fuel, actually. They have coal, but they don't have that much gas. And they are also investing in nuclear. And actually, we've got quite an interesting nuclear program, although it's very slow. So I guess it's not that different a message in that you need to try and find policies that go with the grain of what's politically acceptable in your country. And with India, they really now have embraced solar in a way that, and because India is, labor is cheap, so that one of the fixed costs of installations of solar is actually getting a man on the roof to fit the thing. You know, that's the cost curve kind of peters out at that level because it's expensive. Human beings are expensive. In India, there's a lot of them, and they're quite cheap. So I think you're going to see an explosion of solar in India. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean that there's, you know, the cost of labor is relatively cheap, and so I think you're going to see in India development paths that happen in surprisingly fast. And I think that's true of many countries. Costa Rica is a good poster child for just saying, you know what, we're just going to do it differently. We're going to do 100% renewables quickly, and we're going to get EVs in faster than any other country, and just through the sheer weight of leadership in that country. So, you know, we have to be mindful of the fact that there's going to be pressure to use traditional technologies where they're cheaper, but I think that the leapfrogging is happening more than we perhaps anticipate.
And then we have one last question over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I'm from the Lee School. How important will the UN Sustainable Development Goals be to solving climate change?
Why did you say the last question? It's difficult at the end. You know, I haven't worked a lot on those goals, and something about them makes me a little nervous in that there's just so many of them. I think they obviously are drivers of change, and they're amazing, you know, goals that we should strive towards. I've tended to focus on energy policy more than the Sustainable Development Goals in my career. Partly, I think, why have I done that? I suppose I just see a more direct chain of command from, you know, set a policy for energy, and then there are a certain number of actors, and then they will change their decisions over time and have an effect. I find the SDGs slightly terrifying in their scope and scale, but you know, there are many people who are applying themselves to solving those challenges. And you know, the Warren Buffett donation to the Gates Foundation was just phenomenal. I mean, it's wrong that he should have that much money in the first place, really, arguably, but if he is going to amass that much wealth, deploying it in that way, and in a way that Gates is, you know, overseeing, that's very directed, very evidence-based. You know, there's forces at play in those goals as well, which I think give us cause for optimism. So I think they will be important. I haven't, sorry, got much expertise.
Well, Bryony, thanks very much for that great talk. I guess there's the idea of scale came up. And there's the scale that the problem we're facing is enormous. Then the scale that the time scale that we have to act in is short. But then there's the scale that the number of people who are available to help us to solve the problem is also enormous. So if we can mobilize, as you were saying, in India, if you can mobilize millions of people to be part of the solution, then maybe that's the side of the scale that we can be optimistic about.
Yeah, and we don't know, I mean, also, we're not just going to be relying on people. You know, we've got a digital wave of technology coming. It's already with us. The computing revolution has just changed a huge amount of the parameters that we're working against. So it's not just going to be us, it's going to be lots of all descriptions. Well, as long as we can keep a handle on them.
Bryony, thank you very much for being part of opening up the Cambridge Climate Lecture Series for us. When you go to climateseries.com, this is the website you get. And so if you're unable to come to the lectures live, under the ways to participate, you can watch live online. And also down here are the lecture overviews. And next week we have Anthony Hobley from the Climate Tracker Initiative, who will be talking to us about the 2 degrees C roadmap based on financial analysis. And now all that really rests is for me to say, Bryony, thank you very, very much for coming tonight.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you.
And then we have refreshments out in the courtyard.